For hours, the crew treated the black gentleman like he didn't belong in first class. When the plane began losing altitude and panic set in, he calmly stood up. Silence took over the cabin when he revealed his 40 years of experience. Marcus Johnson adjusted the navy blue jacket over his white t-shirt as he walked down the jet bridge toward Flight 2471. His worn leather duffel bag hung from his shoulder, the same bag he'd carried for 30 years when he was the one flying the plane. The familiar smell of jet fuel and recirculated air filled his nostrils. "Good morning," a flight attendant greeted the passengers ahead of him, her smile bright and practiced. "Welcome aboard." When Marcus reached the aircraft door, the flight attendant's smile flickered for just a moment. Her eyes darted from his casual clothes to his ticket, then back to his face. "Sir, this is the first-class boarding group," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge. Marcus held up his boarding pass. "Yes, I know. Seat 2A. The flight attendant, her name tag read Sarah, examined his ticket longer than she had for other passengers. She pursed her lips before reluctantly stepping aside. Very well. Marcus had seen that look countless times over his 40-year career. He moved past her into the first-class cabin, where passengers in business suits and designer clothes were already settling in. A man in an expensive suit glanced up, then did a double-take when Marcus approached the window seat next to him. "I believe you might be in the wrong cabin," the man said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "2A," Marcus replied simply, pointing to the seat number. He stored his duffel in the overhead bin and sat down, feeling the familiar leather against his back. The memories came automatically, his first flight as captain, right after getting his commercial license in '78. Back then, he'd been one of only 12 black commercial pilots in the country. Sarah appeared beside their row again. "Sir, could I verify your boarding pass one more time?" Marcus handed it over without a word. The businessman beside him shifted uncomfortably. "There seems to be some confusion," Sarah said, frowning at the ticket. "Are you sure you didn't mean to book economy class?" "No confusion," Marcus replied calmly. "I've been flying first class for 40 years. A few nearby passengers turned to watch the exchange. Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she pressed on. "It's just that we sometimes have booking system errors, and I want to make sure you're in the correct." "The booking is correct," Marcus interrupted, keeping his voice level. He'd learned long ago that raising his voice only gave people like Sarah more ammunition. "And I'd appreciate being treated like every other first-class passenger." Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. She handed back his boarding pass and hurried toward the front of the cabin. Marcus could hear her whispering to another crew member. The businessman beside him pulled out his phone, deliberately angling his body away. 2 rows ahead, a woman in a pencil skirt was watching the scene unfold with poorly concealed interest. Marcus had seen it all before. The stares, the whispers, the assumptions. The boarding continued around him. Marcus watched through the window as luggage handlers loaded bags into the cargo hold. His trained eye noticed one of them pointing at the left engine, calling over a supervisor. Something about their body language made him frown. Sarah returned, this time with an older man wearing a supervisor's uniform. "Sir," the supervisor began, "I understand there might be some confusion about your seating assignment." "The only confusion," Marcus said quietly, "is why I'm being asked to verify my ticket for the 3rd time when no other passenger has been asked once." The supervisor had the decency to look embarrassed. He glanced at Marcus's ticket, nodded curtly, and guided Sarah away. Their heated whispers carried back. "You can't just assume." The cabin filled with the usual pre-flight sounds. Overhead bins clicking shut, safety announcements being ignored, flight attendants performing final checks. Marcus felt the familiar vibration as the engine spooled up. But something about the left engine's pitch wasn't quite right. The sound brought back memories of a similar issue he'd handled during a flight to Chicago in '89. "Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Sarah passed by one last time, avoiding eye contact as she verified seatbelts. The plane began to taxi, its movements familiar to Marcus's body after decades in the cockpit. He closed his eyes, feeling the slight angular change as they turned onto the runway. The engines roared to full power, and that odd note in the left engine's sound became more pronounced. Marcus opened his eyes, his former pilot's instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right with that engine, but he'd seen enough newer pilots dismiss older colleagues' concerns to know his warning wouldn't be welcome. The plane lifted off, banking slightly to the left as it gained altitude. Marcus watched the ground fall away through his window, the city becoming a grid of tiny streets and buildings below. The left engine's whine continued to nag at his consciousness. Sarah started her drink service, working her way through first class. When she reached Marcus's row, she addressed only the businessman. "What can I get for you, sir?" "Scotch neat," the man replied. She turned to walk away without acknowledging Marcus. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me." Sarah turned back, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. "Yes, I'd like a coffee, black," Marcus said. "And when you have a moment, someone might want to check the left engine." "The pitch is off." Sarah's smile became more strained. "I'm sure our pilots are monitoring all systems, sir." She walked away without taking his drink order. Marcus settled back in his seat, feeling the subtle vibrations through the airframe. 40 years of experience told him something was wrong with that engine. He just hoped someone in the cockpit would notice before it became a real problem. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but that suspicious engine sound continued to resonate through the cabin. Most passengers wouldn't notice it, but to Marcus's trained ear, it was like hearing a wrong note in a familiar song. He watched the wing through his window, noting the almost imperceptible shimmer that shouldn't be there. The businessman beside him ordered a second scotch when Sarah passed by again. She still hadn't brought Marcus his coffee. The first hint of turbulence shuddered through the plane. Marcus's hand instinctively gripped the armrest, not from fear, but from decades of muscle memory. That's when he felt it, a subtle change in the engine's vibration pattern that made his stomach tighten. He knew that sound. He knew exactly what it meant, and he knew they were about to have a very serious problem. The vibration grew stronger as Flight 2471 climbed through 30,000 feet. Marcus watched Sarah whispering to her supervisor near the galley, both of them shooting glances in his direction. The businessman beside him was on his third scotch, the ice cubes clinking against the plastic cup with each minor shake of the plane. "Mr. Davidson." Sarah approached their row again, deliberately addressing only the businessman. "Would you like a refreshment of your drink?" "Please," Davidson replied, not looking up from his laptop. Sarah turned to leave, but Marcus spoke up. "I'm still waiting for that coffee I ordered 40 minutes ago." "Oh," Sarah said, her tone artificially sweet. "I must have forgotten. Let me check your seat assignment again, just to ensure our service manifest is correct." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. 2A. Same as it was during the last 3 checks. "There seems to be some discrepancy in our system," Sarah persisted. "Mr. Peters," she called to her supervisor. "Could you help me verify something?" Peters walked over, his face set in what he probably thought was a diplomatic expression. "Is there an issue here?" "No issue," Marcus said firmly. "Unless it's standard procedure to verify a black man's ticket 4 times and deny him coffee service." Peters's face reddened. "Sir, I assure you this has nothing to do with—" "Save it," Marcus cut him off. "I've heard every excuse since 1978. Just bring me my coffee." A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine, watching the exchange. Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly very interested in his laptop screen. The plane shuddered again, harder this time. That wrong note in the engine's pitch became more pronounced. Marcus recognized the telltale signs of a compressor problem developing. He dealt with similar issues dozens of times during his career. "Sir," Peters said, his voice lowering, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy class. We have some seats available." "More comfortable?" Marcus turned to face him fully. "I paid for first class, same as everyone else here. The only difference is you keep assuming I don't belong." "That's not what I flew commercial jets for 40 years, Marcus continued, keeping his voice steady but firm. "Carried passengers like you thousands of times. Never once did I ask someone to move because I assumed they didn't belong somewhere." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Peters cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance. "You were a pilot?" "Captain," Marcus corrected, "until I retired last year." Now, about that coffee, another shudder ran through the plane, strong enough to make the overhead bins rattle. Sarah grabbed the back of a seat to steady herself. Marcus noticed a subtle change in the engine's sound, a metallic whine that spelled trouble. "We're experiencing some turbulence." The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Sarah hurried back to the galley without bringing Marcus's coffee. He watched her strap herself into the jump seat, her face showing the first signs of genuine concern as the plane shook again. Davidson finally looked up from his laptop. "Were you really a pilot?" "Captain," Marcus corrected again, his attention focused on the sounds coming from the engine. "United Airlines, 40 years. Started flying crop dusters in 72. The businessman's attitude shifted slightly. "Must have been challenging back then." Marcus almost laughed. "Challenging. That's one word for it. Trained in the Air Force before commercial. Some folks didn't like that much either." Another violent shake rattled the cabin. Drinks spilled. A few passengers gasped. Marcus felt the plane bank slightly to the left, a subtle correction that told him the pilots were having trouble maintaining steady power on the troubled engine. The memory of his first solo flight in 75 flashed through his mind. The chief instructor had tried to fail him 3 times before another instructor stepped in. "Some people just aren't meant for the cockpit," the chief had said. Marcus had proven him wrong with every safe landing over 4 decades. Peters appeared again, this time his demeanor notably different. "Sir, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. Took an emergency for you to see me as a person?" Marcus asked quietly. The supervisor had the grace to look ashamed. "It's not that. It's exactly that," Marcus interrupted. "Same story for 40 years. Only difference is what excuse people use." The plane lurched sharply. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling and swaying with the aircraft's movement. Screams erupted from the economy section behind them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice was tense now, "we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." Sarah was frozen in her jump seat, her face pale. Peters grabbed the interphone, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to coordinate with other crew members. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, steadying himself against the seat as the plane continued to shake. "Sir, you need to stay seated," Sarah called out, finding her voice. "That engine's about to fail," Marcus said calmly. "And based on what I'm hearing and feeling, your flight crew could probably use someone with 40 years of experience right about now." The next shudder was violent enough to throw several passengers against their seatbelts. The cabin lights flickered. That metallic whine from the engine had become a screech that even inexperienced passengers could recognize as dangerous. "Please, sir," Sarah's voice had lost its condescending edge, replaced by barely controlled panic. "You have to sit down?" Marcus turned to her, his voice leveled despite the chaos around them. "You spent the last hour treating me like I didn't belong here. Now you might need my help to survive the next hour." Funny how emergencies change perspectives, isn't it? The plane banked hard to the left. Warning alarms blared in the cockpit. Through his window, Marcus could see the troubled engines cowling, vibrating in a way that meant serious trouble. Peters grabbed the interphone again. "Flight deck, we have a former captain in first class who says..." The engine's scream reached a fever pitch. Marcus braced himself, knowing exactly what was coming next. He'd seen it before, dealt with it before, survived it before. But this time, he wasn't in the cockpit. This time, he was just another passenger, one they hadn't even thought worthy of a cup of coffee. The irony wasn't lost on him as the engine finally gave out with a sound like tearing metal, and Flight 2471 began its emergency descent into chaos. The next few moments passed in a blur of noise and motion. Warning lights strobed through the cabin as the plane's left engine died completely. Passengers screamed. Carry-on items crashed from overhead bins. The oxygen masks swayed like grotesque decorations above their heads. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice sounded strained. "Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. The situation is under control." Marcus knew better. The subtle shifts in the plane's attitude told him the pilots were struggling. He'd been in their position before, trying to sound calm while wrestling with a crippled aircraft. "I need to speak to the flight deck," Marcus told Peters, who was still clutching the interphone. Sarah stepped forward, her previous prejudice momentarily forgotten in the face of crisis. "Sir, even if you were a pilot, regulations state Regulations? Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. We're losing altitude with a dead engine. In about 10 minutes, those regulations won't matter much. The plane lurched again. More screams. A drink cart broke free from its locks, rolling backward before a quick-thinking passenger caught it. Peters! Marcus's tone carried the authority of 4 decades in command. Get me on that interphone. Now! The supervisor hesitated only a moment before handing over the phone. Marcus keyed the direct line to the cockpit. Flight deck, this is Marcus Johnson, retired United captain. 40 years experience, type-rated on this aircraft. You've got a compressor stall that's led to complete engine failure. I can help. Silence for a moment. Then, stand by. Davidson, still in his seat beside Marcus's empty one, looked up with new respect. They're going to let you help? Before Marcus could answer, the cabin lights flickered again. The plane banked harder to the left, fighting the asymmetric thrust from its single working engine. Mr. Johnson, the captain's voice came through the cabin speakers this time, sounding worse than before. I'm not feeling. The transmission cut off. Through the cockpit door, they heard a commotion. Medical emergency in the flight deck. A voice called out. The first officer. Is there a doctor on board? Sarah's face went white. Peters fumbled with his emergency procedures manual, hands shaking. The plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to float momentarily against their seatbelts. A baby started crying somewhere in economy. The sound of retching came from several seats. Get me up there, Marcus told Peters. Now! FAA regulations clearly state, Sarah began. FAA regulations also state that in an emergency, all available resources should be used to ensure passenger safety, Marcus shot back. Your captain's incapacitated, you've got one engine, and we're losing altitude. Which regulation matters more right now? The interphone crackled. Cabin crew, this is First Officer Walsh. The captain is unconscious. Mr. Johnson, if you're qualified, we need you on the flight deck immediately. Peters moved to unlock the cockpit door, his earlier prejudices forgotten in the face of imminent disaster. Sarah stood frozen, watching as Marcus strode forward with the same confidence he'd carried through countless flights. I'll need a copy of the QRH, Marcus said, using the pilot's shorthand for quick reference handbook. I'll get it, Peters said, rushing to comply. Marcus reached the cockpit door just as another violent shudder ran through the airframe. He could hear passengers praying, crying, making phone calls they thought might be their last. Sir, Sarah called out suddenly. I'm sorry about before. Marcus turned to look at her. When this is over, remember how quickly your judgment changed when you needed me. Maybe next time, skip straight to seeing people for who they are, not what they look like. The cockpit door opened. First Officer Walsh, young enough to be Marcus's son, looked up with desperate hope. The captain was slumped in his seat, oxygen mask dangling. Get him out of here, Marcus ordered, his voice carrying the weight of countless emergencies handled. And give me a coffee. Black. I've got a plane to land. As crew members rushed to move the unconscious captain, Marcus took in the flight deck with one sweeping glance. Warning lights painted the cockpit in angry red. The engine display confirmed what his ears had already told him. Total failure of the left power plant. He settled into the captain's seat with familiar ease. His hands found the controls automatically, muscle memory from thousands of hours in similar cockpits taking over. First Officer Walsh, he said calmly, let's save these people. The younger pilot nodded, relief visible on his face at having an experienced hand take control. Outside the windscreen, storm clouds loomed ahead, promising to make an already dangerous situation even worse. Marcus keyed the radio. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is United 2471, declaring an emergency. Single engine failure. Captain incapacitated. Request immediate vectors for nearest suitable airport. As air traffic control responded with coordinates, Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. All those people who'd questioned his presence in first class were now depending on him to get them safely on the ground. Sometimes life had a way of teaching its own lessons about prejudice. Through the cockpit door, he could hear Sarah organizing the cabin for emergency procedures. Her voice shook slightly as she instructed passengers to review the safety cards. Flight level 240, Walsh reported. Still losing altitude at about 500 feet per minute. Marcus nodded, his mind already calculating fuel, distance, weather, and the 1,000 other factors that would determine their survival. Tell the passengers to buckle up tight. This is going to be one hell of a ride. The storm clouds grew closer, dark and threatening. Lightning flickered within their depths. Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of lives in his hands. Lives that just an hour ago hadn't wanted him sitting in first class. Now he was their only hope of seeing the ground again. The storm hit them like a hammer. Lightning flashed outside the cockpit windows as Flight 2471 descended through thick clouds, the remaining engines straining against the turbulence. Warning alerts competed for attention on the instrument panel. 22,000 feet, Walsh called out, his young face gleaming with sweat. Rate of descent increasing to 700 feet per minute. Marcus's hands were steady on the controls, decades of experience flowing through his fingers. Getting a lot of drag from that dead engine. Need to compensate. He adjusted the thrust, fighting to keep the plane level. The cabin interphone buzzed. Flight deck, Sarah's voice trembled. Passengers are asking about our situation. What should I tell them? Tell them we're diverting to Baltimore, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him through countless emergencies. Remind them that this aircraft is designed to fly on one engine. As if to challenge his words, the plane shuddered violently. Overhead bins popped open in the main cabin, spilling contents. Screams echoed through the aircraft. Hydraulic pressure dropping, Walsh reported, his fingers dancing across the backup system controls. Primary systems failing. Marcus nodded, already ahead of him. Switch to secondary. Watch that fuel imbalance. We're burning through the right tank too fast. Through the cockpit door, they could hear Sarah attempting to maintain order. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have an experienced captain at the controls. A massive lightning strike lit up the cockpit. Static crackled through their headsets. Multiple warning lights flashed red. Lost the weather radar, Walsh announced, tension creeping into his voice. Running on backup instruments. Marcus's mind flashed back to a similar situation over Denver in '92. He brought that plane down safely. He'd bring this one down too. Baltimore approach. He keyed the radio, United 2471 Heavy. Request immediate vectors for ILS approach runway 28. Single engine, partial hydraulic failure, multiple systems degraded. The controller's response was professional, but urgent. United 2471. Turn right heading 270. Descend and maintain 15,000. Expect vectors for ILS 28. Weather at Baltimore. Ceiling 800 broken. Visibility 2 miles and heavy rain. Wind 290 at 25 gusting 35. Not ideal, Marcus muttered. He keyed the interphone. Cabin crew, prepare for landing in approximately 20 minutes. Full emergency protocol. Sarah's voice came back, steadier now. Yes, sir. Mr. Johnson. Thank you. The plane pitched suddenly, dropping several hundred feet in seconds. Oxygen masks deployed throughout the cabin as the pressurization system hiccuped. Backup hydraulics struggling, Walsh reported. Flaps might be a problem. Marcus's hands moved automatically, adjusting their attitude. We'll deal with that when we get there. One problem at a time. The interphone buzzed again. This time it was Peters. Sir, we have several passengers having panic attacks. One man's showing symptoms of a heart condition. Get them away from the windows, Marcus ordered. Have them put their heads between their knees. Deep breaths. Tell them I've landed planes in worse condition than this. Another violent shake rattled the aircraft. Warning horns blared as they descended through 15,000 feet. United 2471, Baltimore approach cut in, traffic alert. Corporate jet 12 o'clock. 5 miles, climbing through your altitude. Marcus banked right, using precious fuel to avoid the traffic. The dead engine created drag, making every maneuver more difficult. 15 minutes to Baltimore, Walsh announced. Fuel remaining for 23 minutes. In the cabin, a child's cry pierced through the chaos. Marcus thought of all the families counting on him. People who, just an hour ago, had looked at him with suspicion or disdain. Flight attendants, he called over the interphone, secure cabin for emergency landing. Sarah, I need you to check the left wing. Look for any visible damage around the engine. Sarah's voice came back moments later, fear evident. The engine housing, it's coming apart. There's debris hanging. The plane lurched again, harder this time. Multiple system warnings screamed for attention. Lost the secondary hydraulics, Walsh reported, his voice cracking. Running on emergency systems only. Marcus's mind raced through options, procedures, backup plans. He'd trained for this. He'd lived this. Baltimore approach, United 2471. Request priority handling. Situation deteriorating. United 2471. Cleared direct JYDE intersection. Descend pilot's discretion. Wind now 300 at 30 gusting 40. The storm intensified around them. Lightning flashed every few seconds, illuminating the chaos in the cockpit. Rain hammered against the windscreen. 10,000 feet, Walsh called out. Configuration warning. Flaps inoperative. Marcus nodded grimly. Gonna have to bring her in hot. No flaps means higher approach speed. He keyed the cabin interphone. Flight attendants, this is the captain. Prepare for a high-speed landing. It's gonna be rough. Sarah's response was immediate. Cabin secured, sir. All passengers in brace position. Through the cockpit door, they could hear her voice leading passengers through emergency procedures. The same voice that had questioned Marcus's first-class ticket now put absolute trust in his ability to save their lives. United 2471. Turn left heading 230. Baltimore approach instructed. Descend and maintain 6,000. Emergency equipment standing by. Marcus began the turn, fighting the dead engine's drag. Every movement of the controls required precise calculation. One mistake at this point would be fatal. 8,000 feet, Walsh reported. Fuel remaining for 18 minutes. Lightning split the sky directly ahead. Thunder boomed through the airframe. In the cabin, someone screamed. About that coffee, Marcus said, managing a small smile despite the situation. I think I'm going to need it after we land. Walsh looked at him incredulously, then let out a nervous laugh. Sir, if you get us on the ground safely, I'll buy you coffee for a month. The plane descended through 7,000 feet. Baltimore's lights barely visible through the storm ahead. Marcus could feel the weight of every life aboard pressing down on him. Hundreds of souls depending on 4 decades of experience to overcome prejudice, mechanical failure, and nature itself. United 2471, 6 miles from outer marker, the controller announced. Clear to land runway 28. Wind 310 at 35, gusting 45. Equipment standing by. Marcus took a deep breath. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd fought for, everything he'd proven over 40 years in the air. It all came down to the next few minutes. First Officer Walsh, he said calmly, let's show these people why they should never judge a pilot by his skin color. The runway lights beckoned through the storm, a promise of safety that would have to be earned through skill, experience, and sheer determination. The altimeter wound down through 5,000 feet as Marcus guided the crippled aircraft toward Baltimore. Every control input had to be perfect. Too much correction would send them into a spin, too little would let the dead engine drag them off course. United 2471. Wind shear alert on final approach, Baltimore Tower warned. Previous aircraft reported 40-knot loss at 400 feet. Copy that, Marcus replied, his mind already adjusting the approach calculations. First Officer Walsh. Extend landing gear on my command. Rain lashed against the windscreen as lightning illuminated the airport in strobe-like flashes. Through the cockpit door, they could hear Sarah leading passengers through another round of brace position practice. For 1,000 feet, Walsh called out. 15 minutes of fuel remaining. Marcus keyed the cabin interphone. This is your captain speaking. We're on final approach to Baltimore. It's going to be rough, but I've done this before. Trust me to get you home. The same passengers who'd watched him with suspicion in first class now hung on his every word. Funny how a crisis changes everything, he thought. Sir, Peter's voice came through the interphone. Some passengers want to know your experience with this type of situation. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. Tell them I've been landing planes in emergencies since before most of them were born. April 12, 1979. My first engine failure over Detroit. Brought her down without a scratch. A violent gust rocked the aircraft. Warning horns blared as they momentarily lost altitude. 3,000 feet, Walsh announced, fighting to keep his voice steady. Localizer alive. Marcus's hands moved with practiced precision, compensating for the wind while tracking the instrument landing system's guidance. Landing gear down. Full extend. The gear dropped with a heavy thunk that echoed through the cabin. More warning lights illuminated. The hydraulic pressure barely sufficient to lock the landing gear in place. 2,000 feet, Walsh called. Glide slope alive. Wind shear alert still active. Sarah's voice came through the interphone again. Captain Johnson, I need to say something. Kind of busy right now, Sarah, Marcus replied, his focus on the instruments. Her voice cracked slightly. I'm sorry. The way we treated you. I was wrong. Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see him. Let's get on the ground safely. Then we can talk about prejudice and preconceptions. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The thunder was immediate and deafening. Several passengers screamed. 1,000 feet, Walsh announced. Runway in sight. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Marcus could see the approach lights pulsing. The single working engine strained as he fought to maintain their glide path. United 2471, cleared to land runway 28, Baltimore Tower announced. Wind now 320 at 40 gusting 50. The plane bucked in the turbulence. Without flaps, they were coming in far faster than normal. Marcus's hands were steady on the controls, decades of experience guiding every movement. 500 feet, Walsh called out. Wind shear alert. The bottom dropped out. The airspeed indicator unwound rapidly as they hit the wind shear. Marcus's reaction was instantaneous. Full power to the good engine, nose down slightly to maintain airspeed. 400 feet. The runway lights disappeared in a curtain of rain. Marcus flew on instruments, his mind translating numbers and needles into a three-dimensional picture of their position. 300 feet. Sarah's voice came over the interphone one last time. Passengers in brace position. God help us. 200 feet. The wind shear released them. The airspeed shot up as they emerged from the downdraft. Marcus compensated instantly, adjusting their sink rate. 100 feet. The runway appeared through the rain, a gray strip of salvation lined with pulsing lights. Without flaps, they were going to hit hard and fast. 50 feet. Marcus could feel the lives of everyone aboard weighing on his shoulders. All those judgmental looks, all those assumptions about where he belonged, none of that mattered now. 30 feet. The wind gusted again, trying to push them off centerline. Marcus fought back, using every trick he'd learned in 40 years of flying. 20 feet. Brace, brace, brace. Sarah's voice echoed through the cabin. 10 feet. The wheels slammed onto the runway with bone-jarring force. The spoilers deployed automatically as Marcus commanded full reverse thrust from the remaining engine. No auto brakes. Walsh shouted. Manual braking only. Marcus pressed the brake pedals, feeling for the maximum pressure that wouldn't blow the tires. The plane lurched left, pulled by the dead engine's drag. He compensated with rudder, keeping them on the centerline through sheer skill and determination. Rain-slicked runway streamed past as they decelerated. Warning horns still blared, complaining about multiple system failures. None of that mattered now. Only stopping the aircraft counted. 8,000 feet remaining. The brakes shuddered under the strain. Marcus could smell burning rubber as the tires fought for grip on the wet runway. 6,000 feet. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, lights flashing through the rain. The plane slowly decelerated, fighting physics and momentum. 4,000 feet. The left engine nacelle scraped the ground, sending sparks flying. Marcus held the plane straight through it all. 2,000 feet. Finally, their speed dropped below 50 knots. Marcus guided the crippled airliner onto a taxiway, where it rolled to a stop surrounded by flashing emergency lights. Silence fell in the cockpit. The only sounds were the patter of rain and the tick of cooling metal. Walsh, let out a long breath. That was the most amazing piece of flying I've ever seen. Marcus reached up and started the APU, then began the shutdown checklist with practiced efficiency. Just doing my job? The same job some people didn't think I belonged in. The cabin erupted in applause and cheers. Through the cockpit door, they could hear passengers crying with relief, praying, calling loved ones. The interphone buzzed. Captain Johnson, Sarah's voice was thick with emotion. The passengers, they want to thank you. And so do I. I was so wrong. We were all so wrong. Marcus keyed the radio one last time. Baltimore Tower, United 2471. Aircraft secured on taxiway Alpha. Request emergency vehicles and stairs. We've got some passengers who probably need medical attention. United 2471. Roger that. Sir, that was one hell of a landing. Marcus finally allowed himself to relax slightly. I've had a lot of practice. 40 years of it. Despite what some people thought I could or couldn't do. He turned to Walsh, who was still staring at him with a mixture of awe and shame. Now, about that coffee you promised. Emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 2471 as rain continued to pound the taxiway. Inside the cockpit, Marcus and Walsh worked through the emergency shutdown procedures with practiced precision. The cabin behind them buzzed with a mixture of relief, excitement, and lingering fear. APU running normally, Walsh reported, his hands still shaking slightly as he flipped switches. Battery backup engaged. Starting passenger evacuation checklist. Marcus nodded, his own movements calm and methodical. Get ground crew to check that left engine before anyone exits. Don't want pieces falling on passengers. The interphone crackled. Flight deck, this is Sarah. We have medical personnel requesting permission to board. Several passengers need immediate attention. Understood. Clear them to enter through the forward left door only, Marcus replied. And Sarah? Make sure everyone exits calmly. We're safe now, but panic can still hurt people. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Marcus could see airport emergency vehicles positioning their stairs. Lightning still flickered in the distance, but the worst of the storm had passed, both literally and figuratively. Captain Johnson, Walsh said quietly, I need to tell you something. Marcus continued his shutdown checks. Go ahead. When you first entered the cockpit, I had the same thoughts as the others. Even after you said you were a captain, Walsh's voice trailed off. You wondered if I really knew what I was doing. Marcus finished for him. Don't worry. I've seen that look for 40 years. The young first officer's face reddened. But the way you handled this emergency, I've never seen anything like it. They should teach this in flight school. They did teach it in flight school, Marcus said, making a final notation in the logbook. The difference is experience. When I started flying, I had to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. So that's what I became. A knock on the cockpit door interrupted them. Peters entered, looking both exhausted and ashamed. Sir, we have FBI agents and NTSB investigators requesting to speak with you. And the passengers want to thank you personally. Marcus stood up, his movements showing none of the strain from the past hour. First things first. Anyone need immediate medical attention? 2 passengers with chest pain, 1 possible broken arm from turbulence, and several anxiety attacks, Peters reported. EMTs are treating them now. Prioritize the medical cases, Marcus ordered. Investigators can wait. And tell Sarah I still want that coffee she never brought me. Peters managed a weak smile. Yes, sir. And I'm sorry about earlier. We all are. Sorry because I saved your lives, or sorry because you were wrong about me from the start? Marcus's voice wasn't angry, just tired. 40 years of the same battles would do that to a man. Before Peters could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She held a steaming cup of coffee in trembling hands. Black, no sugar, she said softly. Just like you ordered 3 hours ago. Marcus accepted the cup, noting the irony. Funny how it took an emergency for my drink order to be taken seriously. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Captain Johnson, save it, he said, but his tone was gentle. Right now, we need to focus on getting these passengers safely off the aircraft. There'll be time for apologies later. Walsh was still running through his shutdown checklist. Sir, They're going to want your statement for the investigation. That wind shear recovery. I've never seen anyone handle it so smoothly. I'll tell them what I've been telling people my entire career. Marcus took a sip of his coffee. Skill doesn't care about skin color. Experience doesn't check your social status. And physics doesn't know what class you're sitting in. The cabin door opened again. A man in an FBI windbreaker entered, followed by someone wearing an NTSB jacket. "Captain Johnson?" the FBI agent asked. "We need to debrief you on today's incident." Marcus nodded. "First, let me check on my passengers. All of them, first class and economy. Because that's what a captain does, regardless of how some people might feel about him." He stepped out of the cockpit into the cabin. The passengers, still in their seats, broke into spontaneous applause. Davidson, the businessman who'd been sitting next to him in first class, stood up. "I was wrong about you," Davidson said loudly. "We all were. And we're alive because of it." Marcus raised his hand for quiet. "Listen carefully, everyone. We're going to evacuate calmly and orderly. Anyone needing medical attention goes first. And while you're waiting, maybe take a moment to think about why you were so quick to judge me before you knew who I was." Sarah started organizing the evacuation, her previous condescension replaced by professional efficiency. Peters coordinated with the ground crew. Walsh continued his shutdown procedures in the cockpit. Through the windows, camera flashes indicated the media had already arrived. Tomorrow, there would be headlines about the retired black pilot who saved a plane load of passengers who had discriminated against him. There would be interviews, statements, probably even a few talk show invitations. But right now, Marcus just stood in the aisle, sipping his long-delayed coffee, watching as the people who had questioned his presence in first class filed past him with grateful, shame-faced nods. "Captain," Sarah approached him again, her voice soft. "There's a young girl in row 15 who wants to be a pilot. She's black, and after seeing what you did today..." Marcus smiled for the first time since the emergency began. "Tell her it's not about where society thinks you belong. It's about where you know you belong, and then proving it every single day." The rain continued to drum on the aircraft's fuselage as the evacuation proceeded. Marcus stayed at his post, making sure every passenger got out safely, just as he'd done throughout his career, regardless of how they might have treated him. Because that's what a captain does. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he didn't mind. Some things were worth the wait. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as passengers from Flight 2471 gathered in a secured area. Emergency medical teams worked their way through the crowd, checking on those who needed attention. News crews pressed against the glass walls outside, cameras flashing in the continuing rain. Marcus sat in a quiet corner, finishing his third cup of coffee, each one personally delivered by Sarah with increasing humility. The FBI agents had finished their initial questioning, and the NTSB investigators were reviewing his preliminary statement. Now he watched as the human drama unfolded around him. "Captain Johnson?" A small voice drew his attention. He turned to see a young black girl, maybe 12 years old, standing nervously nearby. Her mother stood a few steps behind, encouraging her forward. "Hello there," Marcus smiled warmly. "What's your name?" "Jasmine," she said, gathering courage. "I was in row 15. I want to be a pilot too." Marcus set down his coffee cup. "Come here, Jasmine. Let me tell you something important." He patted the chair next to him. The girl sat down, her eyes wide with admiration. Her mother moved closer, wiping tears from her eyes. "When I started flying," Marcus began, "people told me I didn't belong in the cockpit. They said a lot of things about what I couldn't do. Know what I did?" Jasmine shook her head. "I proved them wrong. Every single day. Every single flight. Until they couldn't deny my skill anymore." He leaned forward. "The sky doesn't care what you look like, Jasmine. Neither do the controls of an aircraft. All that matters is here." He tapped his head, and here, he touched his heart. Sarah approached cautiously, holding a fresh coffee cup. She'd been hovering nearby, listening to the conversation. "He's right," she said softly, setting down the coffee. "I learned that lesson today. The hard way." Jasmine looked between them, sensing the weight of unspoken history. "Were people mean to you today, Captain Johnson?" Marcus exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. "Sometimes people judge others without knowing them. But today showed why that's a mistake. A big mistake, Sarah added, her voice thick with emotion. One I'll never make again. Across the room, Davidson approached, his business suit wrinkled from the emergency landing. He'd been one of the first to shake Marcus's hand after deplaning, his earlier prejudice replaced by profound respect. Captain, Davidson nodded, then turned to Jasmine. You want to be a pilot? Listen to this man. I was sitting next to him in first class, and I made the mistake of judging him before I knew him. Then he saved all our lives. Jasmine's mother stepped forward. Captain Johnson, thank you. Not just for saving us, but for showing my daughter that she can achieve anything. The terminal doors opened, admitting more investigators and airline officials. Walsh entered with them, still looking slightly shaken from the experience. Sir, he called out, making his way over. The preliminary inspection of the left engine. It's amazing you caught that sound so early. Another hour and experience, Marcus said simply. The kind you get from 40 years of people testing you every day. More passengers gathered around, drawn by the conversation. The same people who had watched him suspiciously in first class now hung on his every word. Tell them about Detroit, Walsh urged. About your first engine failure. Marcus shook his head. That's ancient history. Today's what matters. Today showed why prejudice isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. If the crew had listened when I first reported that engine sound, Sarah flinched visibly. Peters, standing nearby, looked at the floor. But you saved us anyway, Jasmine said proudly. Even after they were mean to you. Because that's what a pilot does, Marcus replied. We don't choose who to save based on how they treat us. We do our job, regardless. An airline executive approached, looking nervous. Captain Johnson, the media is requesting interviews. They're calling it the miracle in Baltimore. We'd appreciate if you'd... No, Marcus cut him off firmly. This isn't about miracles. It's about skill, experience, and the folly of judging people before you know them. The executive shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the publicity could be very positive for the airline. You mean the same airline that still has so few black pilots that passengers assume I don't belong in first class? Marcus's voice was calm, but pointed. Silence fell over the gathered crowd. The executive tugged at his collar. Here's what we're going to do, Marcus continued, standing up. Instead of publicity, let's talk about programs to recruit more diverse pilots. Let's discuss why, 40 years after I started flying, passengers still act surprised to see someone who looks like me in the cockpit. Jasmine watched him with growing admiration. Her mother squeezed her shoulder. Starting with this young lady here, Marcus gestured to Jasmine. She wants to be a pilot. Let's make sure she doesn't face the same prejudices I did. Sarah stepped forward. I'll support that. After today, things need to change. They already have, Davidson added. At least for everyone on that flight. The rain outside had finally stopped. Through the windows, emergency crews were still examining Flight 2471. Its left engine scarred, but its passengers safe, saved by the very man some of them had tried to remove from first class. Marcus turned back to Jasmine. Remember this day. Remember that skill and dedication matter more than any prejudice. And remember that sometimes proving people wrong is the best revenge. The young girl nodded solemnly. Around them, passengers began sharing their own reflections on the day's events, many openly acknowledging their earlier biases. It wasn't perfect, Marcus thought. Change never is. But it was a start, and sometimes that's all you need, a chance to prove yourself, even to those who doubt you, just like you've been doing for 40 years. The following hours unfolded in a blur of activity at Baltimore-Washington International Airport. Emergency response teams had finished their initial assessment of Flight 2471. While inside the terminal, the aftermath of the near disaster continued to reshape perspectives and challenge long-held prejudices. Marcus stood with the NTSB investigation team, explaining in detail how he'd first noticed the engine abnormality. The pitch was off during takeoff roll, he demonstrated by humming the sound. Anyone with experience on these engines would have caught it. The lead investigator, a gray-haired woman named Patricia Chun, nodded as she took notes. But the flight crew didn't respond to your initial warning? They were too busy, Marcus replied diplomatically. questioning whether I belonged in first class. Chen looked up sharply. That will be noted in the report. Failure to heed a safety warning due to prejudicial assumptions. Just tell it straight, Marcus interrupted. They didn't trust a black man's judgment, even one with 40 years of experience. Almost cost them the aircraft. Across the room, Sarah overheard this exchange. She'd been helping coordinate passenger services, but now she approached the investigation team. I need to make a formal statement, she said, her voice firm despite her obvious emotion, about how we treated Captain Johnson, and how our prejudice nearly contributed to a disaster. Chun raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Sarah took a deep breath. I questioned his presence in first class. Repeatedly. Ignored his drink order. Dismissed his concerns about the engine. Even tried to have him move to economy. All because of how I look, Marcus finished. Say it plainly. That's the only way things change. Meanwhile, Davidson had gathered several other first-class passengers. They approached as a group, led by the businessman who had witnessed everything from the seat next to Marcus. We want to make statements too, Davidson announced, about what we saw, what we did, and what we learned. Chen looked at her growing stack of testimonials. This is becoming more than just a mechanical incident report. Good, Marcus said firmly, because it's about more than just a failed engine. The terminal doors opened, admitting airline executives in suits, looking nervous as they surveyed the scene. Behind them came their legal team, clutching tablets and wearing concerned expressions. Captain Johnson, one executive stepped forward, hand extended. We want to thank you for your extraordinary service today. Save it, Marcus cut him off. Instead, tell me how many black pilots you've hired this year. Tell me why passengers still assume someone like me doesn't belong in first class. Tell me what you're going to do about it. The executive's smile faltered. The legal team exchanged glances. Jasmine, who had stayed nearby with her mother, watched this exchange with growing understanding. She tugged at Marcus's sleeve. They're scared, she observed quietly. Not of the emergency, but of the truth. Marcus looked down at her with pride. Smart girl. And you're right. Sometimes the truth is scarier than an engine failure. Walsh approached, having finished his own debriefing. He'd changed out of his uniform, but his posture still showed respect as he addressed Marcus. Sir, I've submitted my report, he said, including my own prejudiced initial reactions. It's all there. We need to do better. Sarah, who had finished her statement to Chun, wiped tears from her eyes. We all need to do better. Starting now. The airline executives huddled with their legal team, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. Marcus watched them with 40 years of perspective. You know what's funny? He said to no one in particular. If they just listened when I first reported the engine problem, none of this would have happened. Prejudice isn't just wrong, it's expensive. Chin closed her notebook. Captain Johnson, this may be the most important incident report I've ever filed. Not just for aviation safety, but for human safety, Marcus finished. Because prejudice damages more than just engines. Davidson stepped forward again. I've been thinking about something. When the emergency started, none of us cared about the color of the pilot's skin. We just wanted someone who could save us. And yet, Marcus replied quietly, an hour earlier, you all cared very much about the color of the passenger's skin. The truth of this statement hung heavy in the air. Around them, passengers who had witnessed everything nodded slowly, their own prejudices exposed in the harsh light of retrospect. A young gate agent approached, holding a tablet. Captain Johnson, there's something you should see. She turned the tablet to show a social media feed. The story was already spreading. How a discriminated against passenger had turned out to be a veteran pilot who saved the aircraft. Comments were pouring in, many from other black aviation professionals sharing similar experiences. It's going viral, the gate agent said. People are talking about not just this incident, but the whole larger issue. Marcus watched the comments scroll by. 40 years of similar stories, finally finding voice. He turned to Jasmine, who was still watching everything with wide eyes. See that? He said gently. Change happens when truth comes out. Even if it takes an emergency to bring it out. The airline executives finally approached again, this time with a different demeanor. Captain Johnson, the lead executive said, "We'd like to discuss implementing immediate changes in our crew training and passenger service protocols. And we'd like your help." Marcus looked at them steadily. 40 years I've been dealing with this. 40 years of proving myself over and over. You want my help? Start by admitting the problem exists. Sarah stepped forward. It exists. I'm proof of that. And I want to be part of fixing it. Me too, Walsh added. Count me in, Davidson said. One by one, others joined in, crew members, passengers, even some of the emergency responders who had witnessed the aftermath. Each acknowledging their own biases, each committing to change. Jasmine tugged at Marcus's sleeve again. Is this how it starts? Change? Marcus smiled down at her. This is how it starts. With truth, with admission, with commitment to do better. The NTSB team packed up their preliminary reports. The airline executives huddled with their legal team, now discussing policy changes instead of liability concerns. Passengers shared contact information, promising to stay in touch, to remember this day, to do better. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Johnson stood quietly, thinking about 40 years of similar moments, each a small battle in a larger war against prejudice, each a step toward change. Sometimes it takes an emergency to reveal the truth. Sometimes it takes a crisis to begin healing. And sometimes it takes a cup of coffee, finally served with respect, to mark the beginning of change. The sun had set by the time the last of the paperwork was completed at BWI Airport. Most of the passengers had departed, carried away by alternate flights or ground transportation, each forever changed by their experience on Flight 2471. Marcus Johnson remained in the terminal, watching the maintenance crews working on the crippled aircraft through the rain-streaked windows. Coffee, sir? Sarah approached, holding out a fresh cup. I think this makes number 7. Marcus accepted it with a slight smile. Lost count after the first few. Quite a change from when you wouldn't serve me one at all. Sarah's face flushed, but she held her ground. I've been thinking about that. About all of it. How many lives were nearly lost because of prejudice? Marcus finished for her. Call it what it is. That's the first step toward fixing it. The terminal had quieted considerably. A few airline officials lingered, discussing the day's events in hushed tones. Davidson sat nearby, having delayed his business meeting to give additional statements. Walsh was still there too, unwilling to leave until everything was resolved. Jasmine and her mother had finally departed, but not before the young girl had made Marcus promise to stay in touch about her future aviation career. Her mother had hugged him, whispering thank you for more than just saving their lives. Captain Johnson? Chun from the NTSB approached with a final set of papers. We've completed the preliminary report. Would you review it? Marcus took the documents, scanning them carefully. Every detail was there, from his first observation of the engine's sound to the final emergency landing. But more importantly, the report included a full account of how prejudice and discrimination had delayed critical safety responses. It's all there, Chun said quietly. Everything, including how preconceptions and bias nearly contributed to a catastrophic failure. Good, Marcus nodded. Maybe someone will learn from it. The airline executives approached one last time, led by their CEO, who had flown in specifically to handle the situation. Captain Johnson, the CEO began, we've spent the last few hours reviewing everything. The incident, the responses, the underlying issues. We want to make real changes. Marcus looked at him steadily. And what changes would those be? First, immediate revision of our crew training programs to address bias and discrimination. Second, a new recruitment initiative focusing on diversity in aviation. And third, the CEO paused. We'd like you to help lead these efforts. 40 years, Marcus said quietly. 40 years I've been dealing with this. No, it's different now. The CEO waited. Now there's proof. Proof that prejudice isn't just morally wrong, it's dangerous. It nearly brought down an aircraft today. Sarah, still standing nearby, spoke up, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it. I've already requested to be part of the new training program. To tell this story, Walsh joined them. Me too. Every pilot needs to hear this. Every crew member. Every passenger. Davidson stood up from his seat. Not just in aviation. This story needs to be told everywhere. about how prejudice nearly killed us all, and how the man we discriminated against saved us anyway. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, considering their words. Through the windows, he could see the damaged aircraft being towed to a hangar. Soon it would be repaired, returned to service, carrying more passengers to their destinations. You know what really needs to change, he said finally. The fact that it took an emergency for people to see past their prejudices. That it took a crisis for my experience to matter more than my appearance. The CEO nodded slowly. Tell us how to fix it. Start with the truth, Marcus replied. The whole truth. About bias in aviation and service in society. About how many qualified people are overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected because of how they look. Sarah wiped away tears. Starting with me. I'll tell everyone how I treated you. And what it almost cost. Include my statement too, Davidson added. About how I assumed you didn't belong in first class, only to have you save my life. Walsh stepped forward. And mine, about how even as a fellow pilot, I had those same initial prejudices. Marcus looked at each of them in turn. That's a start. But real change? That comes from action, not just words. The CEO pulled out a business card. We're ready to take action. Will you help us? Marcus took the card, thinking of Jasmine and her dreams of flying. Thinking of 40 years of similar moments, similar promises, similar hopes for change. Yes, he said finally. But not just for your airline. For every Jasmine out there. For every qualified person who's been told they don't belong. Chun finished gathering her materials. This incident report will be required reading at every aviation safety briefing. Not just for the emergency response, but for the human factors involved. Good, Marcus nodded. Because the next time someone raises a safety concern, maybe they'll listen regardless of what that person looks like. The terminal had grown darker, the storm outside finally passing. Marcus stood up, gathering his worn duffel bag. Where will you go now? Sarah asked. Home, he replied. Then back to work. There's a lot to do. Teaching. Walsh asked hopefully. Teaching, training, changing minds, one flight at a time. Marcus smiled slightly. And maybe having a few cups of coffee in first class, just to see if anything's really changed. Sarah managed a small laugh through her tears. Your coffee will always be served first from now on, Captain Johnson. The small group walked with him toward the terminal exit. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. You know what I learned today? Davidson said suddenly. It's not just about surviving an emergency. It's about preventing the emergency in the first place. And sometimes that means checking our own prejudices before they create the crisis. Marcus nodded. 40 years to learn that lesson. Let's make sure the next generation learns it faster. He stepped outside into the cool night air, his duffel bag over his shoulder. 40 years of experience behind him, and perhaps a lifetime of teaching ahead. Captain Johnson? Sarah called after him. Thank you. Not just for saving us, but for teaching us. Marcus turned back one last time. Keep learning. Keep changing. Keep serving that coffee without checking what class someone belongs in. Then he walked away into the night, leaving behind a changed group of people and a story that would be told for years to come. A story about more than just an emergency landing. A story about prejudice, perception, and the price we all pay for our biases. A story about change, one cup of coffee at a time.